A young seminarian struggles so badly with Latin that his own teachers nearly send him home for good, and it's precisely that same slow, stubborn student who will one day become the priest that all of France travels hundreds of miles just to confess to. This is Saint John Vianney, the Curé of Ars, celebrated by the Church on August 4, born in Dardilly, France, on May 8, 1786. John's childhood unfolded during the French Revolution, when his family risked attending Mass celebrated in secret by priests who had refused to break with Rome. With almost no schooling and a genuine struggle with Latin, he needed years of stubborn perseverance and the direct help of Father Charles Bally just to complete his formation. He was finally ordained in Grenoble on August 13, 1815. After a brief assignment in Eckeley, he arrived in 1818 at the small village of Ars, a place marked by the religious indifference that followed the revolution. John visited every family door to door, taught catechism patiently, restored the parish church with his own hands, and founded a house called La Providence to shelter poor girls. Above all, he gave himself to the Eucharist and to long hours of penance. His reputation as a confessor spread far beyond Ars, and in his busiest years pilgrims crossed the country to wait in line for his confessions, while John remained many hours a day inside the confessional. He tried more than once to leave Ars, afraid he wasn't equal to the mission God had given him, but obedience always brought him back. He stayed there for over 40 years. Pope Benedict XVI later preserved one of his own sayings, "Oh, how great is the priesthood! It will only be truly understood in heaven." John Vianney is remembered today as the universal patron of parish priests, and his life teaches that God doesn't need brilliance to work through someone, only a heart willing to stay when it would be so much easier to walk away. Nearly 18 centuries before Vianney ever heard a single confession, the Church already had confessors of an entirely different kind, ordinary companions who simply refused to abandon the apostles under threat of violence. The Church also celebrates today Saint Aristarchus of Thessalonica, a disciple, missionary, and fellow prisoner of St. Paul who lived sometime in the 1st century. Unlike so many saints from later centuries, there was never a formal canonization process for Aristarchus. His veneration comes directly from apostolic memory and the earliest Christian tradition, and almost everything we know about him is preserved in the New Testament itself. The Acts of the Apostles first introduces him as a Macedonian traveling alongside Paul, during the riot that erupted in Ephesus, stirred up by silversmiths who profited from the cult of Artemis. An angry crowd seized Aristarchus and another companion named Gaius and dragged them into the city theater, exposing them to real danger simply because of their association with Paul. Later, the same book counts him among the companions who travel back with Paul through Macedonia and Asia, and eventually he boards the ship bound for Rome with him, a voyage that would end in shipwreck off the coast of Malta. The text never quite clarifies whether he traveled as a prisoner himself or as a free helper by choice. In his own letters, Paul calls him, with striking affection, my fellow prisoner, and lists him among his closest co-workers. Later traditions describe him as Bishop of Thessalonica and a martyr under Nero, though those details carry far less certainty than the biblical record. Aristarchus has no universal patronage and left behind no recorded words of his own, only a life quietly spent enduring riots, dangerous voyages, and imprisonment beside a friend. And that, perhaps, is the whole lesson. Real fidelity is often invisible, measured only in who stayed. Centuries later, in a Gaul falling apart under barbarian wars, another faithful churchman would spend his whole episcopate simply trying to rebuild what violence kept tearing down. The Church remembers today Saint Euphronius of Tours, born around the year 530, who governed the diocese of Tours from about 556 until his death in 573. Like Aristarchus, Euphronius was never formally canonized. His cult comes from the same kind of immemorial recognition preserved by the martyrology. He belonged to the same family as the historian Gregory of Tours, who would succeed him as bishop and later become one of the most important sources we have for the entire history of the Frankish kingdoms. Euphronius took charge of his diocese at a brutal moment, when dynastic wars tore through Frankish territory and entire cities depended almost completely on their bishops simply to hold together. Tours itself carried extraordinary weight in that world, since it guarded the tomb of Saint Martin, one of the most venerated shrines in Gaul. At some point during his years as bishop, a fire devastated part of the city, and the sources remember him working with real energy afterward, rebuilding churches and restoring the pastoral life that had been interrupted. He founded and reorganized parishes across his territory and took part in regional councils, including the Council of Tours in 567, helping shape common discipline for the churches of Gaul. He also encouraged devotion to the Holy Cross, a devotion gaining new strength across the 6th century. No specific miracle or universal patronage survives attached to his name, and no personal words of his have come down to us. Euphronius is remembered simply as a bishop who kept showing up for a wounded city, and his life teaches that faithful, unglamorous rebuilding is its own form of holiness. 6 centuries after Euphronius, another bishop would pay with his life for refusing to let his diocese's land simply be taken away. This is Saint Ranierius of Split, a Camaldolese monk, bishop, archbishop, and martyr, born in the early 12th century in Italy and killed near Split on August 4, 1180. Ranierius first lived as a monk at Fonte Avellana, a community shaped by the spiritual reform of Saint Peter Damian, where prayer, study, and strict discipline were woven together into one life. He was a close friend of Saint Ubaldo of Gubbio and, already a bishop himself, attended his funeral in 1160. Around 1156 he had taken charge of the diocese of Cagli, where he faced constant political and property disputes in an Italy torn between imperial and papal loyalties. In 1175 he was transferred to the Archdiocese of Split, in Dalmatia, a region then tied to the Byzantine world and fought over by competing regional powers. Records place him at the Third Lateran Council in 1179, showing he remained active in the wider life of the Church almost until the end. The Martyrology sums up his death plainly: defending the Church's rights over land that had been seized from it, Ranierius faced threats and was ultimately stoned to death. Later devotional accounts add a spring that supposedly burst forth at the spot and marks left by his knees in the stone, though these belong to popular tradition rather than contemporary record. What remains certain is that he stayed at his pastoral post facing real violence rather than walk away from a fight over property that wasn't really his own to win. Ranierius is remembered today as co-patron of Split, and also of Cagli, and his life teaches that sometimes holiness looks exactly like refusing to abandon a responsibility, even when it costs everything. In a very different kind of story, the next saint of this day owes her place in history to something rarer than martyrdom: she actually knew the founder of her own religious order in person. This is Blessed Cecilia of Bologna, a Dominican nun and prioress, born in Rome in the early 13th century and remembered by her order as having died in Bologna in 1290. Pope Leo XIII confirmed her cult on December 24, 1891, a recognition equivalent to beatification. By 1219, Cecilia was already living among the religious of Santa Maria in Tempio in Rome. When Saint Dominic himself undertook the reform of women's religious communities, she transferred in 1221 to San Sisto Vecchio and received the habit directly from his hands. At the end of 1223 or the start of 1224, Pope Honorius III sent her, together with 3 other sisters, to Bologna to establish the Dominican way of life at the newly founded monastery of St. Agnes. Cecilia became prioress there and remained for the rest of her long life. Decades after Dominic's death, she dictated to Sister Angelica her personal memories of him from those early Roman years, later gathered into a text called the Miracula Beati Dominici. That account is devotional rather than strictly historical, and its chronology isn't always precise, but it preserves something no other source does: an extended, first-hand description of the founder, remembered by a woman who had actually known him. Cecilia left behind no universal patronage and no securely documented personal saying, but her holiness lived in something quieter: decades of faithful community life and the deliberate work of keeping a memory alive so it wouldn't be lost. Sometimes the greatest service to the Church is simply remembering well. From that same order founding century, we jump forward to Tudor England, where an entire religious community would be slowly starved and executed for refusing to accept a king as head of their church. This is Blessed William Horne, a lay Carthusian brother and martyr of the English Reformation, put to death at Tyburn, London, on August 4, 1540. His date of birth is unknown, but we know he belonged to the London Charterhouse, a community devoted to silence and severe discipline that soon found itself in direct conflict with Henry VIII after his final break with Rome. In 1534 and 1535, the demand that every subject swear an oath recognizing the king's supremacy over the church put the Carthusians before a stark decision of conscience. Priors and monks who refused were executed outright, others were thrown into Newgate prison, where many simply died of starvation and disease over time. William, a brother responsible for the community's manual labor, survived that long and brutal captivity and refused, year after year, to abandon either his habit or his loyalty to the church. It wasn't until 1540 that he was finally swept into a parliamentary act condemning him for treason, without anything resembling the individual trial we'd expect today. On August 4, he was dragged to Tyburn and subjected to the full punishment reserved for traitors, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered. He was, in fact, the very last of the London Carthusian martyrs to die. The church later recognized what was obvious underneath the political charge: his true offense was refusing to grant the king a spiritual authority that belonged to Christ alone. William left behind no recorded words and no universal patronage, only years of silence that outlasted every attempt to break him, proving that some of the strongest witnesses never say a single memorable word. 3 centuries later, in a very different corner of the world, an orphan traveling salesman would trade a life of commerce for one spent walking the actual streets Jesus once walked. This is Blessed Frederick Janson, a Franciscan friar, priest, and missionary, born in Giveld, France, on November 19, 1838, and who died in Montreal, Canada, on August 4, 1916. Orphaned of his father at just 9 years old, Frederick had to abandon his studies in 1856 to support his mother, working for years as a traveling salesman, an unglamorous job that quietly taught him the exact organizational and communication skills he'd later need as a missionary. After his mother's death, he resumed his education and entered the Franciscan novitiate at Amiens in 1864. Ordained a priest in 1870, he served briefly as a military chaplain during the Franco-Prussian War before leaving in 1876 for the custody of the Holy Land. There, across Egypt and Palestine, he helped build churches, organized shrines, and personally re-established the public way of the cross through the streets of Jerusalem, allowing ordinary pilgrims to retrace Christ's final steps. From 1888 onward he settled in Canada, where he founded the Holy Land Commissariat in Trois-Rivières, preached tirelessly, and taught countless faithful about the real places where Christ had lived. He played a decisive role in developing pilgrimages to the shrine of Our Lady of the Cape and helped promote the secular Franciscan order among lay Catholics. He also wrote books, pamphlets, and articles that combined careful historical accuracy with genuine popular devotion, before finally dying of stomach cancer after a long illness. Frederick left no formal universal patronage, but his life shows how ordinary skills, even ones learned selling goods door to door, can become exactly the tools God needed for something much greater. 2 decades into the 20th century, in a Spain torn apart by civil war, a hospital brother would step outside one final time to keep 200 children from going hungry. This is Blessed Gonzalo y Gonzalo, a brother of the Hospitaller Order of Saint John of God, born in Conquezuela, Soria, on February 24, 1909, and killed in Madrid on August 4, 1936. The repeated name is no accident. He received Gonzalo at baptism and inherited the very same surname from both his father and mother, who were relatives themselves. Around the age of 21, he entered the Hospitaller Order, and by 1933 he had been assigned to the Children's Hospital Asylum of San Rafael in Madrid, an institution caring for roughly 200 children with chronic illnesses and disabilities, almost entirely dependent on public donations. Gonzalo's specific task was walking through the city asking for alms and provisions to keep that fragile institution running. When the Spanish Civil War broke out and religious life came under direct attack, the community briefly suspended those outings for safety, but the children's needs simply couldn't wait, and the collections had to resume. On August 4, Gonzalo went out once more to gather help. He was recognized and denounced as a religious brother, arrested by militiamen, and killed near a street corner in Madrid, his body left in public for some time afterward. The church recognized that he was murdered precisely for his religious identity, cut down in the middle of an act of pure mercy. Gonzalo left behind no universal patronage and no preserved words of his own, only the plain fact that he walked out that door knowing the risk, because 200 children needed him to. That same brutal summer of 1936, in Barcelona, a Salesian priest already known for decades of quiet nursing would be killed while trying to reach safety with one final change of clothes. This is Blessed José Badala Paraman, a Salesian priest and nurse, born in Abella de la Conca, Lerida, on January 15, 1873, and killed in Barcelona on August 4, 1936. Coming from a modest family, he entered the Salesian house of Barcelona Sarria as a young adult, professed his vows in 1894, and was ordained a priest in 1900. After a few assignments elsewhere, he returned to Sarria in 1909, where for 27 straight years he served both as confessor and as the community's nurse, caring so constantly for the sick that his own companions affectionately compared him to Saint John of God. When his community was expelled from their house on July 21, 1936, and the college itself was converted into a wartime hospital, José and a lay brother named José Rabasa were given temporary permission to stay behind and care for the wounded. Only 10 days later, on July 31, they too were expelled. They took refuge in a friend's home and managed to obtain travel documents to try to leave Spain safely. But before departing, José went back near Sarria one last time to fetch some clothes, and was recognized on a passing tram, arrested, and killed that same August 4. The Church later determined that his death came purely out of hatred for his faith and his religious identity. José left no universal patronage and no documented personal words, only 27 years of quiet bedside care that proved, in the end, exactly what his whole life had already been about. And we close this August 4th journey in Nazi-occupied Poland, with a young seminary professor who found a way to keep giving even after he had almost nothing left to give. This is Blessed Henryk Krzysztofic, a Capuchin priest known in religious life as Father Henry, born in Zakorzu, Poland, on March 22, 1908, and who died in the Dachau concentration camp on August 4, 1942. He entered the Capuchins in 1927, studied philosophy in the Netherlands and theology in Rome, made his solemn profession in 1931, and was ordained a priest in 1933. Back in Poland, he taught dogmatic theology in Lublin and eventually became rector of the seminary there, work the German occupation violently interrupted. Arrested with other friars in January 1940, he passed through the Sachsenhausen camp before arriving at Dachau that December, where he became prisoner number 22,637. Even while starving himself, he once divided just 2 loaves of bread into 25 portions so his fellow prisoners could each have something to eat. Weakened by forced labor, malnutrition, and illness, he kept helping the elderly prisoners around him until he was finally sent to the camp infirmary, a place very few ever returned from. A fellow friar later remembered one message Henry managed to send from there: "I am lying in bed, as on the cross together with Jesus. I rejoice to be with him and to suffer with him." Weighing barely 70 pounds, he died soon after and was cremated inside the camp. Henry is remembered today as a model for seminary formators and for anyone who has ever suffered persecution for their faith. And with that, we close today's 10 Saints of August 4th. If any of these lives touched you, subscribe here to Saint of the Day, comment asking one of these saints to intercede for someone you love, and share this video with anyone who might need to hear one of these stories today. Every share like that is truly a small act of evangelization. And remember, the full prayer to each of these saints is right here in the video description.